Psych majors psychologists have read it. What are some of the creepiest mental conditions you have ever encountered? I'm not a psychologist, but I was in a mental institution for attempt suicide. Lots of bad things had happened to lead me to that choice. Please don't judge. But, as I was saying, there was this girl there, named Anna, and she would comb her hair in the morning and talk to herself. Sometimes she would start to violently scream at herself. One time she grabbed her hair as if it wasn't her pulling it, and forcefully bashed her head repeatedly into the mirror screaming, "Love Annie! Love Annie!" And at night she would start to play with herself and scream her father's name. I have never been so scared in my life. This girl Anna was only 15. Her father would rape and abuse her. The mother was beaten also. I never want to relive that ever again. I was in a psych ward for depression, and my roommate was terrifying. She was schizophrenic, depressed, and also probably just weird. She punched herself in the face constantly, while whispering to the voices in her head. She also used to sit in the multi-purpose room, TV, games, fridge, etc., on the floor and masturbate. Like, a lot. But she never stopped whispering to herself while she did it. I woke up to pee one night, and she was just in her bed, staring blankly at me. She was moved to long-term facility on my third day there. The worst thing I've actually encountered in terms of creepy was a little developing sociopath. He had history, fire, animals, 6, and was apparently high in CU trays. He was about 11 when I first met him, so no one was going to call him ASPD or anything. But that's what he looked like he was growing into. Anyway, the kid is incredibly funny, smart, and charming. No one can believe what his previous school and doctors were saying about him. I was new there, so I was taken in as well. Then, one day he gets in trouble for stealing, and we had the proof on camera. But he didn't know that. I'm sitting in as a witness security while he's going through this whole series of emotions: surprise, indignation, fear, anger, etc. as he pretends he has no idea why he's being accused. Then we show the tape and he just stops dead, blank expression, and says something to the effect of, "So what? You were just wasting my ducking time?" It was another voice, a completely different personality coming out of this kid like you flipped a switch. I've seen some shit, but that moment was creepy as hell. Edit, tons of questions and replies here. I'm trying my best to respond. Anyone else with experience, please feel free to jump in and add your 2 cents. It looks like there are a lot of genuinely interested people in here, which is awesome. And I hate to leave people hanging. Not a professional, but a friend of mine is suffering the Capgras delusion. We moved apart several years ago and hadn't been in touch very well. I knew she had gone through some stressful times. I had a couple of phone calls with her where she was worried that her computer had been hacked, but she seemed reasonable. Then one day she called me and told me that her husband had been replaced with an imposter. She wanted me to fly to visit her so I could see him with my own eyes and confirm for her that it wasn't really him. Talking to her is simultaneously fascinating, unnerving, and heartbreaking. The worst part is, while she is clearly not correct in her beliefs, she is quite consistent in them and they are utterly real in her mind. Imagine how ducking terrified you would be all the time if you were certain that the most important person in your life was a stranger with mysterious nefarious motivations. Imagine going to bed every night next to someone you thought was out to get you. Imagine spending all day desperately trying to find your husband because he must be out there somewhere. Right? Scariest thing I know of that's real. Locked-in syndrome. You're completely awake but unable to move. People assume you're a comatose vegetable, when really you're just paralyzed. For decades. I've never heard of anything more psychologically incredible than a fugue state, when the mind can't deal with reality, so it just creates an entire new world for itself to live in. Capgras delusion. The Capgras delusion is usually a symptom of paranoid schizophrenia, which seems all kinds of horrifying. Basically, a person with this delusion becomes convinced that a loved one close friend has been replaced by an identical imposter. They'll acknowledge that the person looks the same, but they are convinced that it is someone else, a robot, some other strange explanation. I remember learning about a case where a person ended up killing and cutting open their father's head to prove he was a robot. Paranoid schizophrenia in general, it seems like it would definitely be the most disturbing disorder to personally experience. Most people take for granted that what they see experience is real. But imagine not being able to trust anything you experience or think. I am a paranoid schizophrenic. I don't believe there is anything scarier on the planet than an episode. Nothing is more terrifying than being betrayed by your own mind. The things you hear and see. It's awful. A lot of people know about phantom limb syndrome, in which someone continues to feel as if their limb is still there after it has been amputated, often in great pain. Another interesting one that not many people know about and is almost kind of an opposite is body integrity identity disorder, which is when a person has extremely strong feelings that one or more of their limbs does not belong to them, despite being functional. And often they really want to amputate. From their descriptions, it seems that it is actually very psychologically painful. Sometimes to the point that they will self-amputate because no doctor is willing to amputate a healthy limb. Reactive attachment disorder. I worked at a group home for kids with this disorder and it was creepy before I fully understood it. Children who have suffered severe abuse and neglect early in life often have their ability to form healthy attachments to caregivers, or anyone, destroyed. Some of them would cling to me, call me mommy, and beg to come home with me 30 seconds after I met them. Others would refuse to talk to anyone, hurt themselves and others, set fires and act out any chance they could. Sometimes they would improve enough to be sent to foster homes only to have their behavior come back worse once they were placed in an unstructured family setting. It's extremely tragic because there is basically no hope of a cure and they will have the disorder the rest of their lives. Fatal familial insomnia is pretty frickin' scary. Suddenly, you just start not being able to fall asleep, and you're gone within 7 to 36 months. You gradually lose the ability, along with a number of other symptoms over time, until it eventually, at the end of the last stage, you'll have not slept in a long time, will have been hallucinating and suffering from dementia, and eventually die. Only 40 families, about 100 people, have the disorder. Also, if you have it, there's a good chance you'll have kids by its onset, making the disorder pass down ever further. Scary stuff. I'm a psych major, so not a professional, but in my opinion it is catatonic schizophrenia. Those suffering from this type of schizophrenia, although in the DSM-V they are getting rid of the different types of schizophrenia, there will just be one classification, will sometimes be unable to speak or move. My professor worked in a clinic while in school and told us of one patient who would suddenly lock up into extremely awkward position and not move for extended periods of time. Wife is a psychologist. She says she had delusional disorder. Woman and her mother had paranoid delusions about mom's ex-husband, and were convinced he was stalking them and breaking into their house. The ex had gotten the woman's son, aged 6, a model in contract, and they thought that every picture of a kid in a magazine was him. The images that didn't look like him they claimed were photoshopped. This was so weird and creepy since two people shared the same delusions. Split brain syndrome. Sometimes as a means of treating severe seizures, epilepsy, surgeons will sever the corpus callosum, the connecting tissue between the two lobes of the brain. The good news is that future full-blown seizures are limited to one half of the brain, leaving the patient aware and able to take precautionary measures. The bad news is that, thanks to the lateralization of function, there are essentially two minds in the skull that can each only react to certain forms of stimuli. Patients usually develop workarounds, though. The weirdest part is the occasional outcome of alien hand syndrome, in which one of the brains takes control of one hand and uses it independently. When questions are presented to the controlling hemisphere, the hand can write out its answers, which are sometimes in disagreement with the main brain and the patient's spoken answers. It's been a while since I've studied abnormal psych, so the details might be a little fuzzy. Not a psychologist, but there's a condition where people believe their life is like the Truman Show and that nothing in their life is real. I think that's creepy because there's no way to convince them that they're not part of a TV show. I was once in a party and joined this group of people of which I knew just one person. He introduced me to the others one by one, and when I arrived at the least one, Noah, I shook his hand and petted his shoulder. He grabbed my arm and flipped it around and almost snapped it. Needless to say, it was the most awkward situation in my life, and even thinking about it makes me cringe my teeth. I learned that Noah had been in Afghanistan and he freaked out when something or someone touched him from his back. I'm a psychology major, but this story does not have to do with my schooling. To put myself through school, I work as a receptionist at a swimming pool, and Thursday is the day when individuals with disabilities and mental disorders come to the pool with their workers. I was on the other side of the counter helping the individuals into the change rooms, and one of the clients grabbed my hair and started screaming at me that it was too beautiful and she needed to take it. One of the single most upsetting moments of my life, because after her worker managed to get her to relinquish my hair, she continued to just scream wordlessly until I was no longer in her sight. This. Why? Because there is nothing preventing it from happening to you or me. If a tumor can change something so core to who we are and our views of right and wrong, the implications are pretty horrifying. It would be akin to looking out at an amazing view of the landscape and noticing a glitch in the texture. The selfish love obsession of a teen with severe borderline personality disorder. This girl got hold of a razor and carved a boy's name, let's call him Steve, 10 times into various parts of her body. Then she had sex with another boy so that she could get pregnant, have an abortion, tell her friends that the child was Steve's, and that Steve had pressured her to have the abortion. All this time she had been spying nightly on Steve, had fake installed cameras in his house while he wasn't there to make sure he wasn't dating anyone else, and had introduced herself to every one of Steve's close family members as Steve's girlfriend, while Steve wasn't around. The kicker, Steve didn't know this girl. He vaguely recalled meeting her once, but didn't know her name until I sought him out. He knew someone was pretending to be his girlfriend, but didn't know who. When I was younger, I was a pretty unstable kid, which led to multiple stays in a youth psych ward. One of the times I was in, we got a boy who looked like a 14-year-old fatter, paler, creepier, Jack White. So we find out that he threatened to kill and eat his school principal, which even to a bunch of suicidal teens was psycho as duck. I slightly felt bad for him, because obviously he was messed up in the head. Way more than us at least. But he would say all of these awkward things trying to be funny that ended up sounding like serial killer quotes. Like, do you ever wonder what it feels like to be dead eat someone, which especially to the girls was freaky as duck. So after my roommate gets out, I hear Hannibal Lecter is moving into my room. It's weird, but I just brush it off. I was 250 pounds 5-10 and he was just him. So a few nights go by, nothing weird. And every once in a while when he made a ducked up joke they would pull him aside and tell him to chill out. But one day, I don't see him and one of the doctors calls me in. They tell me he's in his own room in solitary now. They pull out his notebooks and it is filled of his drawings of me while I sleep. Fantasy drawings of him ducking me, killing me, eating me, and pages of ramblings on how he would duck me or how I would taste. It is literally the entire notebook front to back filled with these drawings and writings. I am so petrified that I don't talk or leave my room for days. He apparently got sent to long-term center far away, but I ended up staying even longer since they thought I would heal myself over that. But that's the story. Never saw or heard from him again. Still think about it all the time. It's hard to sleep around other people anymore. Psychologist here. Work specifically with kids with degenerative developmental disorders. And in my day I have seen some shit. There is nothing creepier than something called happy puppet syndrome, aka angel man syndrome. It's a disease most commonly found in children where they always have a happy affect, even when hurt or sad. And top it all off, their gross motor skill are affected in such a way that their limbs move as if they're on marionette strings. It's not a disorder, but I've always found sleep paralysis really creepy. A friend of mine suffers from it. It's often an old woman sitting on him or near him. The hallucination can be so realistic that he can feel her breath on the back of his neck. I have that fairly regularly. The first few years were terrifying when it happened, but when I learned about what it was, and had gotten used to it to an extent, it wasn't so bad. Now it's just something that happens from time to time. And sometimes it's even exciting because I'll start lucid dreaming. All that said, I've never visually hallucinated during it, have had audible though, and I imagine those would be fucking horrifying. I was a preschool teacher in college. One year one of my students was a 5-year-old girl who came to my after-school class who enrolled mid-semester after was taken into foster care. It was discovered that her father would bring home women and grate them in front of her. The bastard would tie her to the bedpost at the foot of the bed and use duct tape to hold her head up so she had to watch. He did this so many times over the course of 2 years that a bald spot eventually formed on the crown of her head. When she came to my classroom for the first time, she came up to me and said hello. She kept her head tilted down so she had to strain her eyes to look up at me as if she was still stuck to the bedpost. This is how she spoke to people the entire school year. She pulled out her hair when it grew back to keep the bald spot there. After that semester I resigned from the school and changed my major.